Hello. Today we're going to talk about the role of leadership and the effects that that has within your organization. Now, last time we talked about org design and some of the decisions you'd make about how you did your design, and that based on the choices that you made, there would be implications to the culture. There'd be implications to what was probably the best model for decision making, right? Whether you're relatively more centralized, relatively more decentralized. Um, in all of that is also the role of leadership itself. Now, I'd said before when we talked about authority, that authority is about the role. It's not about the person. Leadership is about the person. And as I mentioned before, ideally, you want both of them to align on top of each other. When they do, that's great. As I said, unfortunately, that isn't necessarily always the way that takes place. No, just the first slide here is talking about the four tasks of management, right? So leadership is very much a management role. One of the interesting things about leaders and about that whole space is um, leadership is not about the leader, it's about the people that you're leading. One of the problems that people have sometimes if they move from an individual contributor role to a management or supervisory role is that your job is entirely different because it's no longer about what you're doing; it's about what your team is doing. And in the context of that, ultimately, you're responsible for economic performance, right? You're responsible for helping the team members achieve and doing things to organize them and the activities so that they're productive. Managements of organizations are responsible for managing the social impacts of their organizations and the things that they do and when they do them. And there's this dimension of time that's really, really important um, um, in, in management roles and decisions. So ultimately, what do managers do? Well, I mean, you manage a resource. Often the resource is people. It doesn't have to be. It could be money, it could be time, material, intellectual property, physical assets, like all kinds of other things. And positions and titles used vary fairly widely. Certain titles are supposed to represent what kind of level in the organization. Is it more to the front? Is it higher up in the organization? You'll also find that there's conventions that exist depending on where in the world, right? So Canada, US, you see like at the top, you see a lot of, president and vice president and CEO and so on and so forth. Those are very common terms and sort of common roles. Whereas like in Europe, for example, the lead person is often the managing director is often the lead one in the individual. I mean, relatively speaking, they're kind of the same role. They're just the convention around the title that's used is a little different, right? So the title has something to do with where in the org it is, and it will have something to do with, frankly, where in the world they tend to operate. Now, managers are traditionally not paid by time. So if you work longer, you don't necessarily get paid more. It's one of the distinctions between management and individual contributors. Not the only one, because there are individual contributors that are salary based too. But given that their role is about the team and the team's productivity, not their individual contribution, the compensation is usually different. In fact, frankly, the compensation often is a base salary, and then there's usually some kind of a variable portion of it that is tied to team performance. So what are the managers' roles? Well, ultimately, they organize. They're involved in creating value or trying to create value, which is ultimately the organizations do, right? You take all of the various different inputs, so materials and knowledge and people and all of those things, and create something that's worth more than the constituent pieces were. And that the creation of something that's worth more is what ultimately drives the profitability of that organization. Organizer, administrator, things like that are very common. If you are a manager that have direct reports, in other words, you're supporting a team of individuals, supporter, ethicist, motivator, coach, trainer, like all of these things are very important parts. Now, one of the interesting things about management competencies is there are some that are kind of role and industry specific, right? So, for example, if I happen to have extensive knowledge and experience managing in roles and in areas that make extensive use of ERP or enterprise resource planning tools. So, like I really know my SAP, for example, um, that that's a value, but that's a value to other big companies that are running SAP. It's probably not the same value to a SME, which is small medium enterprise, that is unlikely to be running an ERP system, right? So to some degree, technical competences certainly they add value, and they're not going to detract, but the value is where you'll specifically be able to make use of it. It tends to it doesn't it doesn't pigeonhole you, but it tends to focus where the most value is for you. Whereas there are other parts of management competencies that are really about people, right? So those that are good managers and good leaders for people um, have a much broader skill set and have a much broader application, because anytime you have a role where you're leading and supporting people, whether it's a large or a small, whether it's a SME, whether it's a government space, whether it's a nonprofit, like the skill sets are the same. And that's one of the things you find about a number of manager competencies, particularly those that are tied to people, is that um, they tend to have fairly wide application in a variety of different places, right? So if I understand people, and depending on, and I have some ability to morph my managing style, because your managing style is, some of it is about what you're comfortable doing, some of it is about the culture of the organization, the space that you're in, some of it is also about what is it that your employees need from you, right? So my inclination for myself was more of a hands-off coach kind of style, and that worked great when I worked at BlackBerry. When I opened my own cell phone store, that didn't work great, because that was far too hands-off for the employees and for the roles. So I had to be a lot more involved and a lot more hands-on than would have been my natural inclination. But again, it's not about me; it's what those individuals and it's what the team needs. Hiring, training, benefits, reward recognition, professional development, like all of these things, any of the human capital competence things, really you'll find are probably some of the strongest management components, because like I said, it's technically you can manage other resources other than people. More often than not, you'll find managers have direct reports as well as some line of business competencies that usually complement it. We get some slides in here under the same section talking about change management. Change organizationally has always been an issue. I think it's traditionally been a bigger issue than it is today, and only from the standpoint of that the level of change in business has increased pretty dramatically in the last, say, 30 years, to the point where most businesses and most roles have lots of change that happens around them. So people get used to things changing. Now, that doesn't mean that people aren't going to take exception to some changes. Humans tend to resist change. And most of the resistance comes from the fact that we don't really know what it means, right? So it's that fear of unknown, which is why um, one of the traditional approaches that seems to work best in a lot of cases in dealing with changes is being upfront in communicating, right? So if I can communicate to you what what this change is, what does it mean, why are we doing it, what's the impact to you, what's the impact to those around you, all of those other things, it helps lessen. Now, obviously, if the impact is one that you're going to be laid off, or there's something that's going to happen to you that you're going to perceive negatively, I mean, there's potentially still going to be some issues with managing through that. But just inherently, the resistance that you find in organizations often has more to do with not knowing what it means than anything else. Um, Communication, coaching, supporting, anticipating, right? Because when you're going to make a change, so if I'm going to make a change and I'm going to, you know, we make a decision and we're going to remove some middle management roles and redeploy um, some people to different teams. So ultimately, what's going to happen is you're going to have fewer managers and more people reporting to them. You can anticipate what the questions and what the concerns are going to be from the people who used to report to somebody who now will report to somebody else, the people who are going to be moved out of those roles, and then the people who it doesn't have a direct impact on them. We'll all have different questions, we'll all have different concerns, and most of them could be anticipated. So if you tailor your communications to the groups and you're able to make those, you don't want to do it too much in advance of the change. You kind of want to do it when you're actually going to do the change. It goes a long way to reducing some of the resistance. Organizationally, there are some classic roadblocks that kind of prevent change. Lack of cross-functional collaboration is a big one. I'd mentioned this before. When you're first doing your org design, as I said, usually one of the first things that you do is like a functional one. When you create those functional groups and then those teams start getting bigger and bigger and bigger, there's a real danger that those groups will develop their own way of looking at things that's different from other parts of the organization. And if there isn't good collaboration between the different functional areas and communication, that can be a real barrier to change, among other things, right? If you have people trying to drive change that don't have sufficient authority to do so, because culturally in the organization, people may say things, but whether you actually have to do them or not has a lot to do with what's the repercussion and what's the authority level. And people figure stuff like that out fairly quickly. Internal competition for resources can create changes, difficulties with some of these changes. Lack of understanding is a huge one. One of the biggest challenges orgs have on an ongoing basis is keeping the various different people in the various different areas glued together, and then also glued to what the overall role or the overall mission of the organization is. And lack of understanding the implications ends up with all kinds of organizational dysfunction. You get one group going in one direction, another one going in another, you know, doing things at cross purposes to each other, all kinds of potential challenges like that. There's another list of all kinds of various different issues and roadblocks can come up with. We mentioned culture. I mentioned culture a few times. So it's the rules of how we do and what we do. And there's a culture in the family that you're born into or raised with. There's a culture in your larger, society that you live in, and then there's a culture in the workplace, and they're an artifact of people that are together, and kind of as tribal animals, we develop these kind of rules that we communicate in a variety of ways through words and through actions and things like that, that indicate to us what we do. And in fact, this is one of the big things that when you bring on a new employee, this is one of the pieces that you have to address. And you're usually not directly addressing knowing our culture says this and this necessarily, but you'll show them, like, where they sit and who they work with, and this is how we do this and this is how we do that. And then through their interactions, they'll learn kind of, what do we do? When do we show up for work? When do we leave? What's the right way to do this? What's the right way to do that? And it's that shape of those things. That culture also determines how because people will tend to try to fit in with the org or the culture that's there. And by doing so, you kind of drive a unity, if you will, of approach. Oops, sorry about that. So how is it manifested? So some of it is about how power is used or shared. That's a big part of it. So there are distinct cultural implications for more centralized versus more decentralized organizations. I'm not saying right or wrong, there's just implications to it. Your orientation towards risk or safety. So how risk adverse is the organization? And again, no right or wrong. There are different circumstances where you probably should be a little more risk averse than others. Certainly, like if you're in the healthcare or medicine, that kind of area, safety should be a pretty kind of a big thing, right? If you're in a high tech business that's making cell phones or a variety of other things, the the implications of risk for you probably are more about money than they are about other things, right? In which case you can decide kind of what you're more comfortable with, given that higher risk often comes with higher reward, assuming it works out that way. Um, how mistakes are handled is a big tip off for culture, right? So what do you do when somebody makes a mistake? Because people do make mistakes. And in fact, if your employees never make mistakes, they're not trying. If you lambaste somebody for making a mistake, you will teach that employee and anybody else that hears of it or heard you do that not to try things new, because there's a cost, an implication to doing it, right? I'm not saying you should embrace mistakes necessarily. What you want to do is you want to understand what happened, why did it happen, what were the motivations behind it, and then try to figure out from there, okay, so like what do we take away? What do we learn from this particular situation? And then it becomes a building thing. And that supports people trying, right? And ultimately, I think, frankly, most organizations, you want people to try. Because trying helps them grow, trying helps them stretch. How outsiders are treated, right? So when somebody new comes in, how are they greeted? How do you receive those individuals? Because that's a real indication of how you treat each other when they're not present, right? And a lot of these things kind of go to the organizational integrity. Vision, mission, and principles of the organization, right? Which will have a huge implication on the culture, even the physical layout, right? So if you have separate offices where people are kind of siloed away, that creates a very different culture and workspace than cubes or an open area, right? Again, not right or wrong. There's just implications of how that happens. And one of the big things in culture that you'll find practically that happens is you want integrity in whatever culture you consciously create in that organization. And by that I mean you need to walk the walk. So when you say something, you need to actually do that. Because organizations that say one thing but actually act another way, which are certainly not uncommon, that's a very, very significant failure of integrity, and that's taught, right? So if they learn from the executives, and it's usually the leadership team that actually is creating the culture of the organization. If they say one thing, but then they act in another way, they teach everyone in the organization that you say things in a certain vein, but you don't actually do the things in that vein. And that's a real inconsistency, and that's a real integrity issue. Okay, and then I think this last one here, just if you look at organizations from a pyramid structure, right, you tend to have more first line managers than top managers, right, and then middle managers in between. What you do as a manager has a lot to do with where in the org you are, right? So like at the very top, much more of what you do is planning. That's probably the number one part of your organizational tasks that you do. Might be a little bit of organizing, but certainly lots and lots of planning. Middle managers kind of do some of all of them. You're going to tend to see more organizing and directing than you will at the top. And then the front line is far more about controlling, potentially directing, but it's more of controlling activities. And that's kind of how you see the distribution of the different roles. What's needed at the top, there's also time implication of this too, right? So top managers tend to be looking at things from farther out. So I'm less and less dealing with what's happening immediately today. I'm more and more looking at a year, 5 years, 10 years, right? I'm focusing on farther out. Middle managers kind of have a way of bridging the plans from the top to the day-to-day, what's going on in the front line. Right? And then the front line are all about it's what's happening in the moment, right? It's what's immediately in front of you. And you'll find the other thing is that from the top to as you get to the front line, as you move down, it tends to become more detail specific, right? Lots of details at the front line. The details are less clear many times as you move up in the organization.